Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen im Museum Berlin-Karlshorst. Ich bin Jörg Mouret, der Museumsleiter, und darf Sie begrüßen hier im historischen Saal, in dem am 8. Mai 1945 der Zweite Weltkrieg in Europa zu Ende ging. Heute geht es aber mehr um den Kriegsanfang, so in der deutschen Wahrnehmung durch den Hitler-Stalin-Pakt, den sogenannten oder Molotow-Ribbentrop-Pakt. Vom 23. August 1939 gilt das in der deutschen Wahrnehmung immer als eine Vorstufe, als ein Auftakt zu dem dann am 1. September folgenden deutschen Überfall auf Polen und damit dem Beginn des Zweiten Weltkrieges. Und wir reden aber über das, was am 17. September 1939 passierte, nämlich die Rote Armee kam von Osten. Eine Folge dieses Paktes vom 23. August. Und das haben wir zum Anlass genommen, uns Partner zu suchen, das deutsch-polnische Haus. Das gibt dann auch gleich nochmal die Begrüßung durch Herrn Parzer. Gemeinsam diesen Abend zu machen. Im Schatten des Pakts haben wir das genannt, der sowjetische Überfall auf Polen. Das ist durchaus mit Bedacht so gewählt worden, 1939. Viele von Ihnen haben jetzt vorneweg vielleicht schon gemerkt, im Wintergarten hier hinter diesen Türen gibt es eine kleine Ausstellung, die wir vor ein paar Wochen eröffnet haben, Riss durch Europa, wo es eben darum geht, die Folgen dieses deutsch-sowjetischen Paktes darzustellen für die Länder, die es betraf. Das ist ganz vorneweg Polen, das sind dann aber auch Länder wie Finnland, Rumänien, Moldau, es sind Estland, Lettland und Litauen. Und es sind, ja, wie immer man das bewerten mag, Belarus und die Ukraine, die ja begünstigt werden oder auch nicht. Um das auszuleuchten, haben wir versucht, das Podium genau so anzulegen. Wir haben Gäste aus Deutschland, aus Polen und aus der Ukraine, die ich Ihnen jetzt nicht im Einzelnen vorstelle. Das macht die Moderatorin des Abends, Frau Urbanek. Ich möchte aber doch auf einen Punkt noch mal hinweisen bei dem ukrainischen Gast. Wir haben dankenswerterweise Liana Blikharska sehr kurzfristig hier einspringen lassen. Sie kommt aus Lwiw, von der Gedenkstätte Territorium des Terrors. Sie ist eingesprungen, weil die Kollegin, die eigentlich kommen sollte, durch einen Trauerfall verhindert ist. Es eben ein Familienmitglied durch den russischen Raketenangriff auf Lwiw vor kurz 2 Wochen ums Leben gekommen, und deswegen hat sie natürlich davon abgesehen, jetzt hierher zu kommen. Uns holen also die Ereignisse immer wieder ein. Deswegen ist es vielleicht wirklich doppelt und dreifach wichtig, auch ein bisschen über die Geschichte zu reden. 1, 2 Takte noch zu der Ausstellung, die wir Ihnen im Wintergarten präsentieren. Die können Sie sich nachher auch noch mal angucken. Nachher bei einem Glas Wein und einer Brezel, das sage ich auch gleich. Bleiben Sie ruhig. Das machen wir mit Absicht, dass wir uns eben hinterher austauschen können. Diese Ausstellung Riss durch Europa haben wir in Kooperation mit der Heinrich-Heine-Universität Düsseldorf gemacht, mit Anke Hilbrenner, das ist die Professorin, die dort den Osteuropa-Lehrstuhl innehat. Und das war eine sehr, sehr fruchtbare Zusammenarbeit, zumal wir darüber einmal in den akademischen Bereich kamen, zum anderen auch stark verbandelt wurden mit Czernowitz, einer Stadt in der Ukraine. Das ist nämlich die Partnerstadt von Düsseldorf. Diese ganze Ausstellung haben wir von daher auch zweisprachig, dann auch ukrainisch, neben dem Deutsch-Englischen auch ins Ukrainische übersetzt. Das ist auf der Rückseite der Tafeln. Wir werden sie im Oktober einmal umdrehen für 2 Wochen, also da können Sie dann gerne nochmal kommen. Heute geht es aber um Polen. Polen als eben das Land, was das Leidtragende ist, was auch in der deutschen Wahrnehmung wahrscheinlich am stärksten so wahrgenommen worden ist. Ich möchte ganz deutlich für das Haus sagen, vor exakt 15 Jahren hatten wir im Grunde auch wieder aus Anlass des 23. August hier eine Ausstellung Größte Härte, der Wehrmachtsüberfall, der Überfall der Wehrmacht auf Polen, so war das ein bisschen die These der Ausstellung, als Auftakt zum Vernichtungskrieg. Der These muss man nicht unbedingt folgen. Für unser Haus ist es interessant, weil wir oben im Obergeschoss den deutschen Vernichtungskrieg gegen die Sowjetunion darstellen. Aber seit 15 Jahren sozusagen sind wir an dem Thema dran, aus unterschiedlichen Perspektiven. Und ich betone das deswegen, um da auch gar nicht erst den Eindruck aufkommen zu lassen, dass das jetzt für uns so eine Neuentdeckung ist. Der Hitler-Stalin-Pakt als historische Tatsache ist schon lange, schon immer in unserer Dauerausstellung zum Thema gemacht worden. Es gab dann schon auch immer, die letzten Jahre vielleicht zunehmend, Anmerkungen, naja, wir sollten noch auf diesen und jenen Aspekt eingehen. So gesehen ist das ein sehr lebendiges Museumsexponat, möchte ich mal sagen, für uns geworden. Und wir sehen diesen Abend, wir sehen unsere Ausstellung und wir sehen auch die kommende Begleitveranstaltungsreihe bis Januar als eine Fortschreibung dieses lebendigen Dialogs. Zu guter Letzt, heute kam es an, der Begleitband zu der Ausstellung Essays. Essays von diversen Autorinnen aus den Ländern, die ich Ihnen hier ganz kurz genannt habe. Auch das ist ein Konzept, dass wir mit denjenigen reden aus den Ländern, die es ja in irgendeiner Form betrifft und die dann auch erstmal es so darstellen, wie das in der jeweiligen nationalen Perspektive eben darzustellen ist. Egal, ob das jetzt aus deutscher Sicht vollständig ist oder nicht. Wir leuchten das aus. Deswegen herzlichen Dank, dass Sie alle da sind. Herzlichen Dank schon mal an die Gäste, die, wie gesagt, gleich durch Frau Urbanek alle namentlich vorgestellt werden. Jetzt kommt Robert Parzer vom Deutsch-Polnischen Haus und an das auch herzlichen Dank, dass ihr den Weg zu uns gefunden habt. Ich wünsche uns alle einen interessanten Abend.
Ja, vielen Dank, lieber Jörg, für die sehr freundlichen Worte. Auch ich möchte herzlich Danke sagen dafür, dass wir das hier zusammen mit euch veranstalten dürfen. Wie gesagt, mein Name ist Robert Parzer, ich bin Mitarbeiter der Stabsstelle für das Deutsch-Polnische Haus. Vielleicht haben Sie schon über das Deutsch-Polnische Haus gehört, vielleicht auch nicht. Macht nichts, ich erzähle Ihnen jetzt ganz kurz, was wir sind und warum wir auch das hier mitveranstalten. Kurz gesagt ist das Deutsch-Polnische Haus ein Projekt, das es schon eigentlich lange gibt. In Polen hat man schon lange den Wunsch geäußert, dass in Berlin, im Herzen Berlins, an die polnischen Opfer des Zweiten Weltkriegs und der deutschen Besatzungsherrschaft erinnert wird. Um das kurz zu machen, es war ein relativ komplexer Prozess. In Deutschland wurde dieser Wunsch gehört und erhört und im Jahr 2020 hat der Deutsche Bundestag ein solches Gedenkprojekt beschlossen. Zusammen mit meiner Kollegin Agnieszka Wierzchowska, die auch hier sitzt, haben wir dann ein Jahr lang an einem Realisierungsvorschlag, an einem Konzept für dieses Haus gearbeitet, mit der Unterstützung von über 60 Wissenschaftlern, Wissenschaftlerinnen aus Deutschland und Polen und auch aus anderswo. Und dieses Konzept, dieser Realisierungsvorschlag wurde im Juli diesen Jahres vom Bundeskabinett bewilligt. Kurz gesagt, der Realisierungsvorschlag, das Konzept sieht vor, dass das Deutsch-Polnische Haus auf 3 Säulen ruhen soll: Gedenken, Begegnen und Gedenken, Begegnen und Verstehen. Das wollte ich nochmal sagen. Erinnern wollte ich nochmal sagen, weil dieses Haus natürlich auch ein Denkmal umfassen wird. Weil Verstehen uns eine Säule dieses Hauses ist, und man den deutschen Krieg gegen Polen nicht verstehen kann ohne den Hitler-Stalin-Pakt, war es für uns natürlich fast logisch, mit dem Museum Karlshorst diese Abendveranstaltung zu organisieren. Schön, dass Sie hier sind. Bevor wir beginnen mit der Lecture von Jan Tomasz Gross und mit der Podiumsdiskussion, darf ich Sie noch auf Veranstaltungen hinweisen, die wir als Deutsch-Polnisches Haus im September durchführen. An der Kasse vom Museum Karlshorst finden Sie eine Broschüre, wo eine ganze Reihe von, wie ich finde, sehr interessanten Veranstaltungen aufgelistet sind, die wir auf unserem deutsch-polnischen Haus auf Rädern, das ist tatsächlich ein Tiny House, was vor dem Berliner Hauptbahnhof steht, im September durchführen werden. Fühlen Sie sich herzlich dazu eingeladen. Sie finden alle Informationen auch auf unserer Webseite. Nun ist es mir eine große Ehre, Jan Tomasz Gross vorzustellen. Und weil er auf Englisch spricht, werde ich ihn auch auf Englisch einführen. Also, Jan Tomasz Gross is a sociologist and historian, and he's a professor of history emeritus at Princeton University. And Gross is the author of several books, actually of many books on Polish history, and particularly Polish-Jewish relations during World War II and the Holocaust. It's impossible to name all of them, but I just want to make you aware of a few of the more widely receptive ones. Among them are Neighbors, the destruction of the Jewish community in Liww, that came out in 2001. Then Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz from 2006, and Golden Harvest from 2012. Jan Thomas Gross has taught at Yale, New York University, and in Paris, among others. And his book about Liww from 2001, about the Liww massacre, Neighbors, addressed the role of local Poles in the massacre. And Jan Thomas received several honors, among them the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland for a, quote, outstanding achievement in scholarship in 1996. And one has to say that after that, the relations between Gross and the Republic of Poland soured a bit, but that is maybe another story. It suffices to say that Gross's books were subjects of vigorous debates in Poland and abroad. Jan, it is a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robert, for the introduction. My apologies, I don't speak German, unfortunately, and I should have been delivering this lecture in German in Berlin, but I can't, so I'll do it in English, and my apologies for inconveniencing those of you who have to listen to translations. I also want to confess that I have some glass problems. This is a pair of glasses taken off the rack, so I may from time to time squint or have strange facial expressions. It has nothing to do with the subject matter or anything else. It's just my glasses. Without beating about the bush, it is possible to summarize the gist of the story that we have gathered here to commemorate in one sentence. In a striking departure from Aesopian language that he usually employed, the Soviet Commissar for Foreign Affairs and the closest collaborator of Joseph Stalin at the time, Vyacheslav Molotov, for once spoke directly in his keynote address to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR in Moscow on October 31st, 1939. And I quote, "One swift blow to Poland, first by the German army and then by the Red Army, and nothing was left of this ugly offspring of the Versailles Treaty." Unquote. I will hang on the scaffolding of this memorable sentence a bunch of details to paint a fuller picture of what has happened. The story of Soviet aggression against Poland on September 17, 1939 begins in earnest about a month earlier with the German-Soviet Treaty of Non-Aggression. Drafted by the Soviets on August 20, it was approved by Hitler on the very same day and signed in Moscow on August 23. From the names of respective foreign ministers who put their signatures to the document, it is known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Actually, in Germany, you speak also about Hitler-Stalin-Pact, I understand. Concluding this agreement was the final diplomatic coup de grâce with which Hitler dismantled the post-Versailles order in Europe. It opened the way to war by removing the German Chancellor's haunting thoughts of a two-front confrontation with the Western powers and Russia in response to his planned military aggression against Poland. The present pact shall be valid only if a special protocol is signed simultaneously, unquote, was a requirement formulated at the insistence of the Soviets. And thus, a secret additional protocol had been drafted as an addendum to the Soviet-German Pact of Non-Aggression, which stipulated in its point number 2 that, and I quote, "in the event of a territorial and political transformation of the territories belonging to the Polish state, the spheres of interest of both Germany and the USSR shall be bound approximately by the line of the rivers Narew, Vistula, and San, unquote. So, as the enumerated river names indicate, the initial Soviet appetites were quite robust. A small map that appeared on September 25th, this is not the map here, in Pravda, Truth, the main Soviet newspaper of record, shows the demarcation line between German and Russian spheres of interest, one should rather say the dividing line between the two occupations, running along the Vistula River, which flows smack through the middle of Warsaw. If this came to pass, then the Soviets would end up occupying 2/3 of Poland's territory during the initial period of the Second World War, and not, as they had in fact, half of it. But between the publication of the communiqué in Pravda and the signing of the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty on September 28th, note the tightening of collaboration between the two countries in barely 1 month, reflected in linguistic shift from non-aggression, the Treaty of August 23, to friendship, the Treaty of September 28. In the space of this month, Stalin changed his mind. He pulled back eastward the demarcation line to the river Buk and requested free hand to occupy Lithuania in exchange for giving up a sizable chunk of the Polish territory. Hitler agreed to everything promptly. He didn't care about all these arrangements as long as they lifted the threat of fighting a war on 2 fronts for Germany. His mind was made up, and he intended to attack the Soviet Union as soon as the right circumstances prevailed. Tacit military collaboration between the two regimes began on the first day of the war, September 1st, with the exchange of very polite telegrams. Quote, "The chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe would be very much obliged to the People's Commissariat for Telecommunications if, for urgent navigational tests, the Minsk broadcasting station could, until further notice and commencing immediately, send out a continuous dash with intermittent call sign Richard Wilhelm 1.0 in the intervals between its programs, and introduce the name Minsk as often as possible in the course of its programs." Unquote. German ambassador to Moscow, Graf von Schulenburg, promptly transmitted the Soviet reply. And I quote again. "The Soviet government is prepared to meet your wishes in such a manner that the Minsk broadcasting station will introduce as often as possible the word Minsk during the course of its program, which could be extended by 2 hours for this purpose. Please advise whether any definite periods are particularly required for this. If you need a translation, at what time do you plan to conduct a particularly intense bombing campaign against Poland, and your planes need a steady radio beam to find their bearings in the sky?" And the telegram continued. "The Soviet government would prefer to omit the addition of a call sign Richard Wilhelm 1.0 so as to avoid attracting attention." Unquote. At this point, the Soviets preferred to keep their military collaboration with Germany discreet, while the Germans started pushing for a more open Soviet engagement. When would the Soviet Union find it desirable to occupy militarily the part of Poland conceded to it in the secret protocol, inquired von Ribbentrop on September 3rd. Incidentally, it was the very day when France and England declared war on Germany. "Not yet," replied Molotov. "Though in the future the Soviet Union would of course take, and I'm quoting verbatim again, concrete action. It is possible that we are mistaken, he continued in an unusually diffident phrase for a Soviet statesman, but it seems to us that through excessive haste we might injure our cause and promote unity among our opponents, unquote. Our cause and our opponents. A telling prequel to Molotov's speech of October 31st, which I have quoted in the opening lines of this lecture, and a sobering commentary on the current Russian President Putin's claims that Poland, indeed everybody else, the collective West, rather than the Soviet Russia, shared responsibility for the outbreak of the Second World War. A message firmly rooted in this bizarre calendar propagated by Moscow and inherited by Russia from the Soviet Union, according to which the Second World War began in 1941. Well, in truth, as we all know, it began on September 1st, 1939, and from day one, Soviet Russia was involved in it, on the side of Hitler. The following week of heavy fighting on the Polish-German front saw a lull in Soviet-German diplomatic exchanges. Little more than occasional courtesies passed between the two protagonists, such as Molotov's congratulations to the Reich government when Wehrmacht troops reached the outskirts of Warsaw. In the meantime, the Soviet leadership watched the rapid German progress in awe and took steps to field the Red Army weeks earlier than originally expected. It also chose a political justification for its impending military crossing of the Polish border. The Red Army's mission, they intended to argue, is to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian blood brothers from any dangers due to the collapse of the Polish state and hostilities waged by the German army. Quote, this argument was to make the intervention of the Soviet Union plausible to the masses, Molotov told Schulenburg during a September 10th conference, and at the same time avoid giving the Soviet Union the appearance of an aggressor, unquote. After England and France declared war on Germany in fulfillment of their treaty obligations to come to the defense of Poland, Stalin preferred to act with prudence, lest Western diplomats recognize Soviet aggression against Poland for what it was. And his worries were justified. As the British ambassador in Moscow, Sir William Seeds, put it in a cable to the Foreign Office, and I'm quoting, I am not sure what benefit we would draw from declaring war on the USSR, but it would give me personal satisfaction to deliver such a statement to Mr. Molotov, unquote. On the 14th, Molotov pleaded with Schulenburg to be informed when the Germans anticipated the capture of Warsaw. To give credibility to the proposed motivation of Soviet action, he said, it was important not to cross the border before the Polish capital has fallen. In a long telegram dated September 15th, von Ribbentrop instructed Ambassador Schulenburg to finalize the arrangements for Soviet military intervention. He was taken aback by Soviet argument that the German military campaign somehow threatened the well-being of national minorities in Poland. This was, and I'm quoting from the cable directly contrary to the true German intentions. And Soviet intervention on that basis would be in opposition to the desire for friendly relations expressed on both sides and make the two states appear as enemies before the whole world, unquote. Ribbentrop's objections made sense to Molotov, of course, but while conceding that the proposed argument, and I'm quoting him again, contained a note jarring to German sensibilities, he asked German leaders, quote again, in view of the difficult situation of the Soviet government, as we remember it needed to make its military intervention plausible to the masses, not to stumble over this piece of straw, unquote. Stalin, as is well known, kept strange hours. He used to work through the night, and anybody who had important business with the Soviet state had to adjust. So there was nothing unusual that at 2 a.m. on September 17th, the German ambassador was summoned to the Kremlin for a meeting with Stalin, Molotov, and Voroshilov, who was the head of the army there. The three supreme leaders of the USSR informed him that the Red Army would cross the Polish-Soviet border in a couple of hours. And he was shown a note that was about to be handed to the Polish ambassador in Moscow. And I'm quoting now. The draft read to me contained 3 points unacceptable to us, reported Schulenburg later that morning in a most urgent telegram to Berlin. In answer to my objections, Stalin, with the utmost readiness, so altered the text that the note now seems satisfactory to us, unquote. Thus, the diplomatic note the Deputy Commissar of Foreign Affairs Patiomkin handed to Polish ambassador in Moscow, Wacław Grzybowski, 1 hour later at 3 a.m., was jointly drafted by German and Soviet statesmen. We know all the details about the Soviet-German intimate relationships during this period thanks to the files of German foreign ministry captured by the Allies and then, courtesy of the government printing office in Washington and the Cold War, put out for all to see in English translation in 1954. A multiple-volume publication provides a detailed record of Soviet-German collaboration at this early stage of the war, including truly amusing details of mutually exchanged courtesies where Soviets, as a junior partner, are particularly eager to please. We don't have time for this, but I recommend the reading if you want to amuse yourself. So much for deconstructing Vyacheslav Molotov's initial confession that the conquest of Poland in September 1939 was a joint project of Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia. Let me now tell you a few things about the circumstances of Soviet entry into Poland and their behavior as conquerors. The way the situation evolved over the next 2 weeks, the conquest and the taking over of this territory by the Red Army, can no longer be told in a straightforward, linear manner. It comes about in the context of a military rout of the Polish army on the Western Front and a massive flight of civilians and military personnel to the east. Social services collapse, radio stations go off the air, newspapers stop appearing in print. Nobody really knows what is going on. Before escaping to the neighboring Romania with the rest of the Polish government, on the very day when the Soviet invasion began, the Supreme Commander, Marshal Rydz-Śmigły, issued orders not to resist the Soviets. Made little difference, the chain of command and the lines of communications were already broken. When the news of Soviet armed incursion across the frontier arrived, the Polish administration in the eastern half of the country disintegrated. In the power vacuum that ensued, a civil war fueled by ethnic hatred opened up. During the interwar years, Polish administration, police, and the military acted as thoughtless and oftentimes ruthless colonizers in the areas settled by Belarusian and Ukrainian peasants, and now local residents were paying the price. From the beginning of October, a next phase of Soviet subjugation of the area began. The preparation of a plebiscite to be held on October 22nd, on the basis of which the Soviets will incorporate half of Poland into the Soviet Union. It's a fascinating story, richly documented, but not a subject to be considered today. For the moment, I simply want to alert you to the frenetic speed with which the events were being pushed along. On August 23rd, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact gets concluded, a complete surprise to all governments engaged in the European crisis at the time, and to communists all over the world. Then came the Soviet aggression against Poland on September 17th. A surprising development as well, especially to the Poles. And 1 month later, a plebiscite is held all over this area. An astounding organizational feat in which the Soviets attempted, and pretty much succeeded, to reach every grown-up inhabitant in the area, subject them to electoral propaganda, and bring them to voting booths. To illustrate confusion brought about by the Red Army's march across Poland's frontier following September 17th, I will draw on personal testimonies collected barely 2 years after the events, from people who had witnessed what has happened all over the area. The testimonies are deposited in the archives of the Hoover Institution. For the most part, I will quote common folks who often speak with unexpected literary flair and directness. Here are the words of one Anna Gimzewska from Nowogród Voivodeship, and I'm quoting her. Of course, she does it in Polish, and I'm translating into English. When one misty September morning on the Moscow-Warsaw road, tanks, armored cars, cavalry, and infantry in combat gear appeared, moving westward, we suddenly faced a number of questions for which we had no answers. Where was this grey army decorated with red stars going? Was it bringing us assistance or final defeat? What was the meaning of all this? At first, we were completely bewildered and taken by surprise. Crowds that lined up the streets and roads in villages and towns were trying in vain to solve this burdensome puzzle, unquote. As we shall hear momentarily, not only crowds lining up roads were confused, but also higher civil servants and military officers. One of the characteristics of Soviet entry into Poland was that the locals, on occasion quite numerous and hence crowds, were curious, friendly, and sometimes enthusiastic at the sight of the Soviets. The collapse of the Polish state, was not unwelcome news to a lot of people, especially youth from among the so-called national minorities, which made, in fact, a vast majority of the population in Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. And for Jews, the arrival of the Soviets was good news also because it meant that the Germans, whose atrocities committed against the Jews in Poland were already known through either rumors or direct experience of Jewish refugees, it meant that the Germans will not be taking over the area. And naturally, there were also groups of communist sympathizers here and there. Not numerous, but very vocal and visible where they had a chance to demonstrate their enthusiasm. I'm quoting. I think the Jews awaiting the Messiah will feel, when he finally comes, the way we felt then. It is hard to find words to describe the feeling, this waiting and this happiness. We wondered how to express ourselves, to throw flowers, to sing, to organize a demonstration, how to show our great joy, unquote. These are the words of Celina Konińska, a pre-war member of illegal communist youth organization from Lwiw, which I recorded during an interview in Tel Aviv in 1980. Simultaneously, fear of the Soviets was widespread. The days following the Red Army's entry to Szczuczyn, we read in a deposition of a housewife named Czesława Maliszewska, were so frightening and sad that I didn't leave the house during that time. People were grabbed in the streets and hauled to prison or had red bow ties attached to their garment and nobody could say anything in protest, unquote. Or, as per this recollection of a chimney sweeper from Rohatyn County, and I quote, when the Bolshevik army was coming into Polish territory, total depression and panic prevailed. The weaker ones took their lives, others hid in the woods, and the strongest were nervously observing, unquote. Make what you will of this poetic statement, but take my word, please, that there is plenty of evidence of fearful memories among older folks of mayhem which engulfed this area during the First World War and then the October Revolution and the Polish Bolshevik War only 20 years before. As to confusion concerning how to make sense of Soviets' unexpected appearance in Poland and what to do about it, note the actions and words of a few civil servants who did not panic and flee, but tried to exercise their responsibilities as best they knew how. In Tarnopol, County Prefect Majkowski urged the population through loudspeakers to give a friendly welcome to the entering Soviet army. Posters signed by the mayor of Stanisławów and appealing for a calm, friendly reception were put up throughout the city on the morning of September 18th. In Równe, these are all major cities in the Polish so-called Kresy, the county prefect came out personally with a retinue of local officials to greet the spearhead of the Soviet column. He thanked the Red Army profusely for bringing help to Poles locked in combat with the German invaders. In Kopyczynce, a city official spoke from the town hall balcony. "Gentlemen, Poles, soldiers, we will beat the Germans now that the Bolsheviks are going to help us," unquote. Soviet columns marched through Tarnopol and Łódź side by side with detachments of the Polish army, each giving way to the other at intersections or not paying much attention to the other's presence. This peaceful coexistence, here and there, didn't last long, we are told. 1 or 2 days in Łódź and barely an hour in Kopyczynce before local officials got finally arrested and soldiers disarmed and taken prisoner. For my taste, the best example of reigning confusion is provided by the testimony of Colonel Kazimierz Ryziński, Chief of Staff to the Commanding General of the Lwiw garrison, General Langner, who, after learning that the Soviets have crossed the border, decided that he will surrender the city not to the Germans, who kept the city under siege for a couple of days already, but to the Soviets, who are Slavs and who, in his judgment, will eventually assist the Poles in their war against Germany. Ryziński was sent to Red Army's temporary headquarters nearby to negotiate the terms of the ceasefire and eventual surrender. He was met there by an officer who introduced himself as Colonel Ivanov. This was, in fact, Ivan Sierov, the head of the Ukrainian NKVD. And the following conversation between the two officers ensued, as written up in Ryziński's post-war testimony. I quote, "What do you know about us?" Ivanov had asked. "We know that you came, that you have reached Lwiw, but we don't know why you came," we answered. "So you know nothing from the radio or the newspapers?" "We have no time to listen to the radio, and newspapers do not get here anymore," we said. Then he stated that they would fight the Germans together with us, but that they wanted first to enter the city, unquote. I mentioned to you the brewing threat of a civil war in the power vacuum that was spreading before the Red Army arrived. Towns, all sorts of communities, were bracing against anticipated ethnic violence from the surrounding countryside, populated by Belarusian or Ukrainian peasants. In that spirit, they often improvised citizens' militias, Straż Obywatelska, to protect their communities. I want to share with you a wonderfully eloquent narrative left by one Jan Węgrzyn, the head of the welfare department from the town of Baranowice, population of 23,000 at the time, telling what happened after he got the news about the Soviet invasion. and I quote, "Within 2 hours, I organized a citizens' guard exclusively from Poles I knew personally. I armed 186 people with rifles left at the police station. They put on blue armbands. A crowd was gathering in front of the city hall shouting, 'Down with the Polish government.' Around 10 o'clock, armed workers from the Socialist Party arrived, led by Machaj, who requested that I immediately pull back the militia with the blue armbands. We came to terms with Machaj, agreeing that people I called into the militia would stay, except that they would put red armbands on. I hadn't yet managed to issue the new instruction when about 30 communists ran into the city hall, led by a certain Rajski, shouting, 'Enough of your government, get out!' After a longish discussion, we agreed that the city must be defended against robberies and excesses until the Soviet authorities arrived. Machaj, however, was arrested on Rajski's orders." Unquote. A whole history of revolution, from Mirabeau to Robespierre, or from Kerensky to Lenin, played out in the space of a few hours. But the arrival of the Soviets in a given locality did not mean necessarily that an authority was established, thereby avoiding a breakdown of social order, though sometimes it did. It often played out differently, as the Soviets deliberately encouraged the revolution, as it were, to run its course. Propaganda materials disseminated by the entering Soviets called for the local population to rectify the wrongs it had suffered during 20 years of Polish rule. Leaflets urged soldiers to turn their weapons against their true, in other words, class enemies, capitalists, landowners, and officers. Other leaflets called on the local population to assault Polish landlords with whatever was at hand, scythes, axes, or pitchforks. Paliakam, panam, sabakam, sabaczaja śmierć. For Poles, masters, and dogs, a dog's death, read the text of one such tract disseminated near Młodeczno. And although we may not be sure of the exact content of any specific leaflet without seeing a specimen, and some we have, the message sent throughout the conquered land was deeply imprinted in the minds of those who experienced the Soviet invasion. I quote, "After the Red Army entered the village," it is village Maszów in Luboml County of the Wołyń Voivodeship, "Lieutenant Minkov, Commander Lwiw, and the commander of the 234th Regiment of Heavy Artillery from Kiev ordered everybody to assemble and delivered a fiery speech saying that they brought freedom and equalization to all classes. They said that they authorized people to go and take away what rightfully belongs to them, and to avenge the pains of 20 years of exploitation. Kill and take the property of those who filled their pockets and barns with your blood. If you do not succeed on your own, the Red Army will assist you." Unquote. Similarly, a Soviet officer addressed the inhabitants of Świsłocz village, Wołkowice County, Białystok Voivodeship. Quote, "For 20 years you lived under the yoke of the masters who drank your blood, and now we have liberated you and we give you freedom to do with them as you please." Unquote. In the village Chorodziej, Nieśwież County, Nowogród Wojewódzki, Commissar Daniłow climbed onto a makeshift platform and addressed the population that was brought to the marketplace. Quote, "If someone has a grudge against somebody else, he can do with him what he wants, take his property or even life." Unquote. There were also direct acts of violence carried out by Soviet officers, soldiers, or NKVD operatives. But what strikes me as quite remarkable is that the dominant mode of violence had this character of civil war, or communal violence, if you will, when the protagonists were local people encouraged and often helped when acting out on their grudges to carry out deadly assaults on each other. This was, in an eerie way, a foreshadowing of the first wave of mass killings of the Jews that will take place 2 years later in the summer of 1941 throughout this area. Thousands of people had been killed as a result, and numerous episodes of cruelty are recorded in the testimonies. Simultaneously, not all was so gruesome about the Red Army's coming. There was something truly bizarre, indeed amusing, about conquerors that were so ill-clad, smelly, they used malodorous tar to impregnate footwear, ill-fed, and unacquainted with a variety of ordinary material objects that they encountered. Countless anecdotes circulated about, for example, vast amounts of foodstuffs consumed on the spot by Red Army soldiers, or misappropriation of commonplace items by the Soviets, especially given their universal denial that anything they saw and laid their hands on was new to them. U nas wsio jest. We have everything, was a standard reply. As one teenager put it, quote, I saw in the marketplace in Zdolbunov how these Soviet people ate eggs, shell and all, horseradish, beets, and other produce. Country women rolled with laughter, unquote. For a genuine communist, whom I already mentioned to you, Celina Konińska, I quote her again because she may not be suspected of malicious distortion when articulating these observations. First contacts with the Russians, I'm quoting her, I mean with the Soviet soldiers, struck us with something strange and unpleasant. We thought that every soldier was a communist, and therefore it was also obvious to us that each must be happy. So their comportment, their behavior struck us as bizarre. First of all, they're looking after things, after material objects, watches, clothing, with so much interest and so much rapacity. We waited for them to ask how life under capitalism was and to tell us what it was like in Russia. But all they wanted was to get a watch. I noticed that they were preoccupied with worldly goods, and we were waiting for ideals, unquote. As a teacher from Braszewice, Drohyczyn County, put it, with the Soviet invasion of Poland, and I quote him, a hungry world and a satiated world came in contact, unquote. All of this had a humanizing impact on the occupation. This was not an encounter of some primitive indigenous population with a Kulturträger conquering nation bent to carry out a civilizing mission. You might think precisely the opposite, because it was a case of a communist country conquering a swath of territory and subjecting it, presumably, to the implantation of a new, historically advanced and just social order. I could share with you, if time allows, some observations about Marxist literacy, or rather illiteracy, of the Soviet apparatus that will arrive in the second wave, so to speak, to take over administrative positions in the area. But when circumstances allowed, away from public view, in private encounters, friendly interactions full of mutual understanding and empathy for each other's circumstances were taking place. Mamasha, dawaj kuszać. Little mother, give something to eat. One Soviet soldier is reported to have said to a countrywoman after he had been assured in response to his question that there were no Polish masters around. Хорошо не будет. Things will deteriorate, were parting words of another Red Army soldier to a peasant family who offered him something to eat. Highbrow intellectuals, and there were plenty from all over Poland who fled to Lwiw, for example, describe engaging conversations and social evenings with Soviet writers or cultural administrators who arrived in Western Ukraine weeks or months after the Red Army. A sort of intimacy of interaction that one would not find in diaries or reminiscences about life under the German occupation. It mattered, though the local people were not fully cognizant that it was so, that the Soviets were as vulnerable to repressiveness of Soviet power as the people who had only now been subsumed under its authority. This, in addition to irregular Soviet soldiers or a functionary's poverty, hunger, or fascination with previously unseen material objects, was the great equalizer. I am about to conclude my remarks, and I do not want to end with a cliché that this was a complex story and we haven't touched all the aspects worth talking about. I would like to propose instead a very specific bottom line to this talk, if you will. It seems to me that the overall experience, and in absence of direct experience, then the prevailing intuition of residents of this area was the boundlessness of violence of which Soviet power was capable. This played out already during the first few weeks in the context of the combined, genuine, and additionally induced civil war. And it manifested itself soon enough in a paralyzing fear at the thought of being sucked into the interior of this behemoth, as Churchill characterized the Soviet state, this riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. What knocked the locals completely off kilter were mass deportations, which in 4 big waves of February, April, and June of 1940 and June 1941 uprooted in brutalizing circumstances 250 to 300,000 people. Numbers are hard to pin down. Entire families, including newly born, sick, and the elderly of the putative enemies of the Soviet Union, were put on cattle trains and transported for weeks to faraway destinations in the Soviet interior. The most terrifying, because it was the first, and because it took place during bitterly cold winter weather, was the February 1940 deportation. Scores of people died even before deportation trains took off for unknown destinations. When we were transported by the NKVD on February 10, 1940, from Młynów to the station at Ożerany, 5 children died, including my son, who was 1 year old. I remember this frosty day when we were brought to the station from our village, another village in another part of the country. The Soviets were going from one wagon to the next, carrying frozen children under their arms and asking, "Zamierzchych rybiat nie ma? Are there any frozen children?" Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jan, for this very deep insight into what Soviet occupation in Poland meant, into this brutal regime, but also insight into the many ambivalences that came into existence after the occupation. And I think it's hard for me to not think about my Ukrainian friends who live in these ambivalences and under this oppression since at least 2014. But now I think it's time to debate, and I would like to introduce to you the moderator of the discussion, Joanna Urbanek. She is a curator at the House of European History in Brussels, and she has published widely on the history of the German occupation of Poland. And one publication which was especially inspiring for us when we worked on the concept for the German-Polish House is called Codzienność w cieniu terroru, Daily Life in the Shadow of Terror, which is a critical edition of photos that were made during the German occupation. And she was also part of our team of experts who advised us in the process of preparing the concept. Ms. Urbanek, it's great to have you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for this warm invitation. And now I will proceed to present our other speakers, Jan Tomasz Gross. Thank you very much for this fantastic, inspiring lecture. And our two other speakers are Liana Blikharska. She is representing an NGO post-Bellum, which is gathering all our history accounts about the current events in Ukraine. But she's also a historian and former research fellow at the Museum Territory of Terror in Lwiw, which is built on the site of the former Jewish ghetto and the former Soviet prison, which gives additional context to our discussion today. She specializes in the history of Lwiw, intellectual history, and oral history. She is a PhD candidate at the Ukrainian Catholic University. And our third speaker, Jan Behrends, is professor of history at Viadrina University, European University Viadrina. He specialized in the history of the Soviet Union and communism, as well as post-Soviet social and political landscape. His research interests include propaganda and public discourse. I would like to maybe start from still talking about what happened at the very beginning of World War II in the Polish territory, and then go into more micro-historical approach. We have an excellent expert on Lwiw, and then maybe pass to the memory and what we are observing today, what is changing, what is not changing. In your lecture, you mentioned a lot of accounts of the local population, what happened to them. And of course, this is an interlude to Holocaust. You both published on Holocaust and deportations that you also mentioned in your lecture. Would you tell us something more about refugees, about the moment of chaos just after German invasion and then Soviet invasion? They were crossing the border to be extensively going to the west, others went to the east. Jews were going towards the east. How did it look like in the first weeks and months, and what happened to them later when the occupation was established?
The problem of refugees, I mean, it's a huge problem, of course, of any episode anywhere in Europe where countries get invaded and armies move forward, then you find throngs of civilians as well as the military who gets defeated on the road, so to speak, and running away. In Poland, it was the story was very confusing, if you will. I mean, the war starts in the West, of course. It's completely, the secret protocols are unknown, and nobody anticipates that there will be an attack from the East by the Soviet Union. So the German advance produces a huge flight of the population and creates crowds of refugees, not to speak of the military itself, which is being routed. You have several categories of if you will, of the refugees in this instance that may be kind of singled out. And maybe those of you who have seen a film by Andrzej Wajda, Cutting, another aspect and moment of course, of this story, which I haven't spoken about it, but then you may have a visual representation of it. But I want to mention two categories. One is Jews who are fleeing from being overwhelmed and taken under the rule of the Germans. It's very well known what Jews can expect. It's not very well known. You don't know exactly, but you know it's not good news. You don't want to be under the German rule if you can help it. So a lot of people are fleeing east. Also, the presumption is that the women and children will be left in peace. So it's mostly male individuals. But again, not a rule, but... and the other thing which happens, and which produces a big outflow to the east, is on September 7th, if I'm not mistaken, in Warsaw, the head of the civilian defense, Colonel Umiastowski, broadcasts an appeal to all able-bodied men who have not yet been properly conscripted into the army to go east because the front will be reorganized, re-engineered in the west. So you had another big push of civilian population that was running there. But you know, otherwise, it's the fate of refugees is like the fate of refugees that we may see on our television screens. It's just people are lost and they find themselves in extremely big hardships, so to speak, and then when the Soviets came, then it became doubly confusing because people who were running from the Germans from west to east suddenly found themselves under the Soviet rule. They didn't expect it, of course. They just wanted to go east. So a lot of mess, big mess.
And then those both occupying forces start to discuss how to deal with those refugees, and there is an exchange of population. That's another element of this early cooperation, right?
Yeah, there was one element of the collaboration between the Soviets and the Germans was to organize, yes, exchange of populations. There was a special commission that was called into existence, and people could sign up and presumably on the grounds of sort of ethnic background mostly. So it was a huge surprise. This commission starts functioning in the spring of 1940. It was a huge surprise to find, and actually there is a note of it in Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs that have been published. Nikita Khrushchev was the head of the Ukrainian party, so to speak, and the top guy, so to speak, in the occupied areas too, as a result of it. And he speaks of his complete stupefaction as he is driven around Lwiw, or I don't exactly remember the location, to see before the seats of these commissions long lines of Jews who want to go back from under the Soviet rule now to the Generalgouvernement, to rejoin their families whom they have left earlier on. In general, there is profound confusion and ignorance about the circumstances that are taking place anywhere. You know, there is no free press. There is no journalist. You cannot write freely and describe in letters what's going on. So rumors, the coin of occupied society is rumors as a fundamental way and manner of communication. And plus the experience that you have of the circumstances where you are. And so under the Soviet rule, it was pretty hard to live. Materially, there were a lot of political repression going on, and people just decided, you know, I don't want to stay here. I want to go back. If I may end with just one anecdote. I think it's recalled in Wajda's film too, but it's a staple, so to speak, of historiography of this period. There is a bridge on the river Bug or San, I don't remember which one of these boundaries, between German occupation and Soviet occupation. And there is a bus load going in one direction and a carload or whatever going in the other direction. And in both vehicles, people just are watching the others and making this gesture. But you just fled from what was uncomfortable. You didn't know where you were going.
And Lwiw, it's an extremely interesting example of a city where both armies meet. And there is the discussion what to do, who should enter the city. Whereas there you have a flood of refugees who already managed to arrive. Would you tell us more about this period of first occupation of Lwiw, please?
Thank you so much for your question, Joanna, and thank you, Professor, for your wonderful lecture. And actually, so I was preparing to tell you something about Lwiw, and your professor was, taking a lot of interview sources, interview materials, and I prepared also the interview materials to start with, because as an oral historian and I do also intellectual history, and these two perspectives, they will form a bit my answer to your question. So as the post-Bellum Ukraine, we do oral history, and I will start with a quote from one of our respondents, Ivan Hrečko. Ivan Hrečko was born in 1929, so he was just 10 years old, and he was born in the village of Rafailowa, Karat Bystrica, in Ivano-Frankivsk, so actually that's like more than 100 kilometers from Lwiw. But after the Second World War, he came to Lwiw, he was working there as an engineer, he obtained an education there, and he became a dissident in the 1970s and also an art collectioner. But that's interesting that his family, his mother and sister, they were deported to Siberia, and his father and brother, they fought at the Ukrainian insurgent army, so at the Ukrainian resistance. And so what he tells us about interwar Nadvirna, that's the small city where his village was located nearby. So Nadvirna, as every Galician town, had three national components. There were Ukrainians who occupied the suburbs, so to speak, of Nadvirna and the city. They were Jews who were exclusively engaged in trade, and they were Poles who controlled the government that existed then, the Polish government. So the sentence, this is very similar situation to that in Lwiw, or at least that would be most commonly be an answer when you ask people to explain you what was the situation in mid-war Eastern Galicia, where majority of Ukrainians living in the surroundings, Jews and Poles, majority of cities in smaller shtetls. And coming back to Ivan, later Ivan talked about his childhood and war, and he told that, people all expected what would happen. People were trying to guess what would happen because they were informed about what was going in Soviet Ukraine in the 30s. So they weren't really, happy about Soviets to come, but also it was still rumors what was happening in Nazi Germany, and of course people knew, so they weren't really happy about Germans came either. So he tells later that people were beaten up there, taken to Siberia. Also, they knew about the famine. The church said everything. From the pulpit of the sermon, the priests were talking about everything. Well, there was also the press. This was a newspaper deal. Then they also wrote about this there. The man gathered in the house in the evening, and he tells about his own house from the perspective of child. And one who could read, who, as they said, knew letters, he was reading, and then everyone discussed the news, then discussed possible actions. They were so patriotically naive, those old men, they were so extremely devoted to the national cause. So from these excerpts, you could grasp what people imagined. So for them was clear what was happening in Soviet Ukraine, as I said before, but at the same time they had this news from the Third Reich, especially neighbors who were Jewish. So this situation in being in between was ambivalent to people who were discussing the best possible way to gain in case of Ukrainians and to secure in case of Poles the independence. And it was a lot of interconnected ideas. I mean, people faced the assimilation before, mixed marriages, conscious choice of identity, and like this heritage of national ideas of 19th century. And I will end this quotation that I was saying, and the interview that I had with Ivan. So Ivan said one more interesting thing. We didn't win Ukraine by force, but we talked it out. And the statement highlights the intellectual and political debates of inter-Worldview, where various Ukrainian parties and circles, from nationalists to conservatives, discuss different futures for potential Ukrainian state. Some advocated cooperation with Poland, while others saw connections with the Soviet Ukraine as the only way forward. And as historian Timothy Snyder has called this region bloodlands, the violent and destructive events of the 1930s and 1940s did not happen in isolation, as Marian Turski reminded us on the 75th anniversary of Auschwitz liberation, that Auschwitz did not fall from the sky. Why I'm having this prolonged, context to answer your question, I just wanted to portray this ambiguity and what was what was imagination of people who would face this and who would found themselves in between of two totalitarian regimes. So another way to analyze this last part of Hrečko's interview, we won Ukraine as the result of the Second World War, but we could also analyze this as the result of the first Soviet occupation. So I just wanted to stress that this first Soviet occupation in Lwiw, it was also the moment when Lwiw became the most Ukrainian version, I mean, for that time, because it was a Ukrainian cultural institution that was opening, and they were replacing Polish institution, as for example, University of Jan Kazimierz was replaced by Ivan Franko University, and it was also new institutions opened as the branch of Ukrainian Academy of Science. And with this having in mind, we are coming back to the outbreak of the Second World War and the first Soviet occupation. The use of the term occupation that I'm using here in the period of 1939 and 1941 is associated with the non-recognition and the international level of the annexation of the Polish states, eastern part by the USSR, as well as the de facto non-recognition of the new regime by the majority of population. And by some of local population, it was also a moral choice to call it occupation even after the Yalta conference. So on first days of September, Nazi Luftwaffe bombarded Lwiw, destroying Sknilov airport, main railway station, and other strategic point. The local conflict between Poles and Ukrainians in these days remain little, also because of Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance decision in support of Polish government. And however, in the memoirs of Ukrainian intelligentsia, we could read about searches in Dilo by Polish police. And Dilo was main Ukrainian newspaper in the region that started, so the searches started the last day before Soviets entered on September 17. And also, after the capitulation of city of Lwiw that was signed on 22nd of September and started Soviet rule. So on 20th of October 1939, months later, a West Ukrainian National Assembly voted for union with the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the same was for Belarus. And after the election, two city and oblast councils took place, and to Supreme Council of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic election. And all the processes that took part in the Republic began in Lwiw. I mean, collectivization, nationalization of private property, introduction of new centers of culture, education, and science. As I mentioned before, this replacement of the Jan Kazimierz University with Ivan Franko University, and the Institute of Polish History with Institute of Ukrainian History. So on the first day, Soviet authorities were prepared to eliminate any potential resistance, political or physical. So main local politicians, as well as Ukrainians and Polish, they were arrested, and as well as administrative workers and especially Polish officers, but to not face a situation in which the place of influential political, cultural, and social figures being empty, the Soviet authorities invited to Lwiw Ukrainian artists from Soviet Ukraine, I mean Aleksander Dowzhenko, Pawlo Tyczyna, Aleksander Korniczuk, and Polish left-wing writers who fled Warsaw, as Wanda Wasilewska, Jerzy Borejsza, Anatol Stern. And the idea was to create a narrative of liberation, the people from the Polish feudal lords, and liberation not only in national terms but also as social class. So that was the main narrative. And later, a lot of these intellectuals, they faced repressions, and for example, Watt, Paper, and Stern, they were arrested, and the next day, article titled "Crush the Nationalist Snake" appeared in Czerwony Sztandar, and so Red Flag newspaper, where articles of accusation in nationalism, they were publishing nearly every day. And I just wanted to stress out that this accusation of nationalism became one of the most popular during that time, and especially after 1944, and the term nationalist became so abstract in popular use. Yeah.
If I may, this is a very interesting point that I would like to maybe I would like us to elaborate. I'm talking to all the speakers, whoever wants to intervene, because also how the Ukrainian aspirations, national aspirations were treated, that changed after a while. So it wasn't just a promise to be kept, isn't it? Maybe you could also explain this context of the Soviet occupation.
Yes, so as I just mentioned before, so it was this National Ukrainian Council that proclaimed these territories as being now Western Ukraine, and Western Ukraine will, representatives of Western Ukraine will to join the Soviet Union. And so this, like the city faced Sovietization, but at the same time it became Ukrainization, and like for Ukrainian intellectuals and Ukrainian like professors and people in general, it was this big possibility, because as I mentioned before, they weren't really like, it was different ideas how to gain Ukrainian state, and a lot of them, they had cooperation with like the intellectual centers in Soviet Union and Soviet Ukraine. And I just wanted here to recall Ukrainian historian Ivan Kripikevich, and I'm writing my dissertation about him. And he gained very, he decided to have very interesting survival strategy, because he was playing double. He was at the same time a member of National Assembly, and he voted for Western Ukraine joining the Soviet Union, and he got a place in a local council after the election, and he published a lot of materials in Wilna Ukraina, which was also another newspaper publishing that time in Lwiw that replaced the Dilo that I mentioned before. But at the same time, Kripikevich was publishing his books on history of Ukraine in Krakow, that was in in this Nazi occupied part of Poland. So it was this, and a lot of Ukrainian intelligentsia or intellectuals, they also fled to occupied by Nazi territories because they weren't sure about their future. But I mean, this ambiguity of strategies that people choose, that's the very interesting point.
Thank you very much. And then maybe we could go further, and would you tell us what happened when in the end of June 1941 German troops entered the city. At that time in the city there was like a huge number of Jews who fled German occupation, and now they find themselves under threat.
Sure. So during that time is one of the most brutal tragedies in the history of Lviv happened, because it was Lviv's pogrom. But like, you know, in talking to this program, and I'm not really an expert on this, and we have brilliant books by Kai Struve and also other researchers as Joel Paul Himka, and they really explain there deeply, because, you know, it's hard to answer in just 1 or 2 minutes. We should have really wider context for that. But what happened in Lviv, that, as I mentioned before, a lot of people, they were kept in prison. I mean, like Ukrainian, and not only Ukrainian, but also Jewish and Polish intellectuals that didn't migrate or didn't escape, or either they weren't yet deported. So they were kept in prison in Lviv, and on the last days of Soviet occupation, Soviets shoot and murder all these people. So when Nazis came, they had really a good opportunity, you know, to split the people and really to begin this like genocide in Lviv. And they opened the prisons, and they called people, you know, to come and show them bodies, and of course members of militia, Ukrainian militia, together with Nazi Wehrmacht soldiers, they started the pogrom. And that's, as I mentioned before, that's really, you know, like a cornerstone topic, and a very important topic. So we really need to provide more context and to explain what happened, but just you know, to stress it out, that it was very interesting the moment when it happened, and it was like the precise moment when it happened, and it also was the precise moment when it ended. So it lasted for 3 days, like from the end of June, like the 13th of June, until the 2nd of July. Yeah, thank you.
And incredible brutalization caused by the occupation. How do we remember those events, and how the memory shifts? You mentioned that the mere term occupation, first occupation, second occupation, is the subject of debate, or has been now being more and more widespread. I would like to maybe ask you to maybe Jan Behrends, would you elaborate on how the Hitler-Stalin-Pact was described? Maybe we can actually start with the Katyn massacre, because it's a very good example of how during already Nazi occupation of Poland, we have the idea of creating certain vision of what had happened.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I mean, speaking here in Germany, I think we should say that that there are unequal memories, right? I'm sitting here, you know, with two Polish historians and one Ukrainian. I think the memory of the Hitler-Stalin-Pact is much more vivid, of course, in Eastern Europe, much more alive, especially also in the Baltic states, not only in Ukraine, but also there, than here. And that is something, first of all, from a German perspective that we need to talk about, and where we have to see that there are maybe deficits in our memory, because mostly when we talk about the beginning of the Second World War, I mean, for good reasons, obviously, we talk about the 1st of September. But for example, this date, the Soviet intervention in Poland is much less known, and so I think is also the Hitler-Stalin-Pact, which is also, you know, I mean, we could also talk about terminology, right? It's still called a non-aggression pact, although we heard in the lecture of Professor Gross and also in the impressions from Lwiw that, of course, it was an aggression pact, right? It was a pact of aggression against Poland, which didn't only want to destroy the Polish state, but basically the Polish nation, its elites, its whole way of life. And this is what you so vividly described, that this whole world was turned upside down, and especially the war, of course, early on, was declared against Polish elites, not only in Ukraine, but you just mentioned Katyn, but also, you know, from Lithuania through Belarus, through the German-occupied part of Poland. And I think this is also one of the things that is also one of the things that should be remembered in the Deutsch-Polnisches Haus, which we talked about, that this whole story of the occupation and also of the genocide against the Polish people is much less known, for example, in Germany than the Holocaust. Again, you know, we can say why this happened probably, but even, you know, there were like statistics last week, a poll about where Germans were asked about the Holocaust, and apparently the German population thinks that in the Holocaust mainly German Jews were killed, which of course is also historically not true. So there are, you know, different layers of deficit in also our historical memory, which is very Western-centered. And, you know, one of this could also be Katyn. I don't know how many people in this room know the story of Katyn. I mean, since the Vaida movie, of course, it's become more popularized, if I may say, but you know, people have heard more about it, but it is basically the murder, of course, by Stalin's secret police of Polish officers that were taken prisoner, and it's one of the stories of the all-out war, we have to say, of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany against Polish elites and the people who were running Poland as a state, because, you know, as Molotov said, I think you quoted this, you know, the idea was to wipe Poland from the face of the earth forever, basically, and that's something that I think is also maybe sometimes not realized here in this country. And since you talk about memory, I mean, you know, but also the ambivalences of Ukrainization. I was last week in Vilnius, of nationalization. Vilnius is another city that was a very multi-ethnic city before 1939, before the Hitler-Stalin-Pact. It was very Jewish, it was Polish, partly Lithuanian also. It's now a completely Lithuanian city, right? This is also another, you know, result in the end, of course, of this pact and of the Second World War. And you know, the question is what we make of it. I don't know. I mean, this is not for me to decide. Also, you know, I mean, that basically, of course, these countries in Eastern Europe, they still live in the borders made by the Hitler-Stalin-Pact. You know, more or less. You know, there were some changes, but it's very interesting that even when the Germans invaded in 1941 into the Soviet Union, and Stalin starts the talks with Churchill about the alliance, the Grand Alliance, right, against Hitler. From the very beginning, he refuses to give any of these territories back, even when the Germans are sort of like on the gates of Moscow. He says, no, but I'm going to keep, you know, Lithuania and Belarus and the Baltics and all this. This shows his determination, geopolitical determination, to hold on to what was gained in this in this pact, even in the face of defeat in the winter of 1941, and it shows the importance until today. And another thing that was mentioned briefly in the beginning was, of course, also the story that is still told in Russia that this war began in 1941, right? Because the official Russia, Putin's Russia, wants to talk about Великая Отечественная война, the Great Fatherland War, but it doesn't really like to talk about what happened in the 2 years before the German invasion of Russia. Of course, as a German, nobody wants to take away, or German historian, the idea that it was, in the end, Germany, of course, who invaded in 1941, in 1939. Still, I think that maybe the picture also here, but also, you work for the European House of History. In Europe, it, as a whole, should become more ambivalent, more ambiguous, more more detailed to live up to these East European experiences, but also talk about, this is maybe my last point, I was in Paris for a conference a while ago, and I think, and we were also talking about this beginning of the Second World War, and it was interesting that many of the French historians don't really realize that the French defeat of 1940, which was so catastrophic for France, basically also a result of the Hitler-Stalin-Pact, because why could the Wehrmacht do this blitzkrieg? Because they knew that they were safe in the East, right? This is why it didn't happen in 1914, but it happened in 1940. But many French think that this is some sort of like homemade disaster. Well, maybe that's partially so. I'm not an expert on France, but it's clearly also another, consequence of the Hitler-Stalin-Pact, which is much more, I think, of a European event than it is remembered today.
Thank you. I mentioned Katyn massacre because its memory reveals to what extent the pact was a sort of taboo, to what extent it was not known, to what extent actually people knew what happened, knew about it. So my question to you would be to explain us more what Poles, Germans, international community knew about the pact and how the knowledge shifted during the Cold War until 1992.
Well, I think it very much depends on, again, from which country perspective you talk. I mean, in the West, the so-called secret protocols, of course, were known from the late 40s, beginning of the 50s onwards. I mean, there were, if we talk about Katyn, there were already awkward moments at the Nuremberg trials, because the Soviet side wanted to try the Germans for the Katyn massacres, right? Because they had the idea that this was done by the Nazis, which of course was not true. The Nazis did many other crimes in this area, but not the Katyn massacres. And in the end, they don't do it because they understand that, this is not a show trial like they do in the Soviet Union, but the other allies would not go with that. So I think it was always a struggle for the truth. Of course, especially in your countries, in Ukraine and Poland, where the truth, or in the Baltic states, where the truth about the Hitler-Stalin-Pact could only be revealed in samizdat and drugi objekt and underground literature by underground historians, because it couldn't be talked about in the official literature, and it becomes something that is only possible to discuss after 1989. But at the same time, you already have a whole West European or German narrative that's out there by the time that you even enter the discourse, right?
And what about the Russian discourse on the topic?
Well, the Russians have always had great problems with the Hitler-Stalin-Pact. They would like everybody to forget about it. They denied the secret protocols for a long time. Even Gorbachev, who was, supposedly for glasnost, denied their existence until the very end. It was Boris Yeltsin who then, for a short time, admitted that they actually existed, and I think he even apologized to Lech Wałęsa at some point in the early 1990s for the secret protocols and whatever the Soviets did to Poland. But with Putin again, you know, they're back to the state of complete denial. And if you look at Russian school books that came out, you know, in the last couple of years, they will not mention this. And of course, the whole chronology, you know, starting the Second World War in 1949 is part of this Russian denial of what happened between 39 and 41. And the other interesting thing, I think, or terrible thing, if you want, is, of course, that we all know that history doesn't repeat itself, but then in some way, of course, it does, right? I mean, if we look at these referendum that we were talking about in Western Ukraine and Belarus to join the Soviet Union, you know, you might be, which was set up in a very short period of time, as you said, you know, you might be reminded of, for example, the referendum that they had in Crimea, or, you know, I mean, the Soviet or Russian methods have in some ways not changed so much. It's about manipulation of history, it's about fake referendum, you know, fake volonté générale, basically, that is constructed. It's about disinformation. All these things we've been dealing with during Stalinism, and in a very unfortunate way, of course, mostly for Ukraine, but at the end of the day, for the whole of Europe, we're dealing with all of this again.
Thank you very much. I would like to leave some time for the questions from the audience. Okay, here is the microphone, and just I need a second in case I don't understand something.
Und Fragen können, glaube ich, auch einfach auf Deutsch gestellt werden.
Mein Name ist Michael Paquet. Ich habe mal eine Frage, die treibt mich schon längere Zeit um. Warum haben eigentlich England und Frankreich, als die Sowjetunion Polen am 17. September angriff, der Sowjetunion nicht den Krieg erklärt? Ja. Gibt es dazu irgendwelche Informationen? Ja. Ist ja doch irgendwie außergewöhnlich, sage ich mal, weil ja doch die Garantieerklärung Englands und Frankreich für ganz Polen galt, ja nicht für einen Teil Polens.
Frankly, I don't know the archives and what kind of deliberations that they may have had at the time about this, but it seems to me that Western powers, France and England, were in such terrible military peril and difficulty at the beginning of the Second World War that the last thing which any of these governments would entertain. I mean, let's remember that in the early phase also, these were this is the government of Chamberlain in England, not very war interested, as it were, and equally the French didn't quite know what to do with this with these circumstances. So as the cable which I quoted to you from the British ambassador in Moscow indicates, he put it, I don't know what possible benefit we could derive from declaring war on the USSR. They just they were fighting for their lives and didn't need any more enemies, as it were, on their plate, it seems to me. I don't know that it was ever seriously considered outside of exchanges of the sort that this British ambassador in Moscow might have had with the Foreign Office.
Hallo, guten Abend. Ich habe folgende Frage. Es steht hier im Mittelpunkt dieser Nicht-Aggressionspakt als Hauptursache von alles, ja. Und es sieht so aus, als alle am Podium Sitzenden der Meinung sind, dass ohne diese Pakt wahrscheinlich keinen Angriff Deutschlands gegenüber Polen gäbe. Ist das wirklich jemand von Ihnen der Meinung, dass ohne Pakt gab es keinen Angriff Deutschlands an Polen? Das ist die erste Frage. Und zweite gehört Ihre Aussage, Herr Behrens, gegenüber Frankreich. Ihre Aussage, dass Niederlage Frankreich ist auch eine Folge des Pakts, ist äußerst diskutabel, kann man so sagen. Ja. Als ein Argument dazu wollte ich nur sagen, nennen, Churchill am 1. Oktober 1939 im Radio hat gesagt, dass Stalin oder Sowjetunion, ich zitiere nicht, ich wiederhole den Sinn, die Sowjetunion hat de facto der zweite Front geschafft, weil Hitler wurde gezwungen, viele Truppen an deutsch-sowjetische Grenzen zu behalten. Wahrscheinlich das ist sogar nicht eine Frage, sondern ein Kommentar. Ja, Dankeschön.
Maybe someone would like to comment on the question part.
Well, I disagree, frankly, of course, because we know that, you know, if you look at the military matters in 1940, that the bulk of the German army was first in Norway and then in the Western campaign. It was not on the border with the Soviet Union. That's what happened 1 year ago. And of course, I mean, you can draw a line from you know, the pact to the defeat of France. For example, the whole German war machinery was highly reliant on all the resources and materials coming from the Soviet Union that, as you know, came until the very day that Hitler invaded. You know, the trains with the iron and with the coal were running and keeping the German war machine going. And of course, this is directly connected to the defeat of France. How can it not be?
Thank you a lot for this exhibition and for all of your lectures. I want to ask about the influence of this pact, because this is something what I've missed in this exhibition, or perhaps it wasn't the goal. Like I want to shift the view a bit from Europe, but to what Far East. What was the influence of this pact on German and Japanese relationships? I'm originally from Kazakhstan. In our school, it's taught that this pact also kind of helped to create certain, let's say, Unklarheiten between Japanese and German, and that at the end Japanese haven't decided to invade Soviet Union in 1941. Perhaps you can just suggest any literature or comment it somehow. Thank you.
I'm very sorry, I had no knowledge of this aspect at all, so I couldn't suggest anything to you.
I think that's a very good question, because it signals that a new panel is needed, and we should expand not only to talk about Europe, but to put it in a global context. So thank you, and sorry we are not able to help at the moment.
Could you please say something about the role of the legal Polish government in exile in London? It was not mentioned. Did it play a certain role, a strong role? Please comment. I'm very interested. With the last president in exile who died with 102 years, whose name was Raczynski.
You know, this is a moment of great transition, as it were. There is no really working government in exile at the time. The government is just in the process of self-exiling itself. It's running out of the country and going to Romania, as you know, and it will take time before any framework will be established that is later on, as we know, there is a very important presence in diplomatic conversations and also in running and assisting resistance to German occupation, in particular from the Polish government in exile, first established in France and then as France was being defeated, moved to London. But at this stage, it's just a moment of great confusion. So perhaps the most significant element here is that the commander-in-chief, Ryszmigły, literally on the day, on the 17th of September, when the Red Army crosses the border, issues orders not to resist the Soviets. So, yeah, but of course, very, very shortly afterwards, it's clear what the situation is, and that there is a lot of diplomatic activity that goes into countering Soviet influence, and then it's a very important issue in 1941 when Germany attacks the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union switches sides, and from being a de facto ally of Hitler, it becomes an ally of the Allies. Then there is an important role that's being played by the Polish government in exile, and the whole Polish question in the relationship between the Allies and the Soviet Union, of course.
I would like to come back to the unequal memories that you mentioned, Jan Behrens, because I think they're very important, and they are very nicely addressed in the exhibition as well. But you mentioned and discussed the Russian Soviet memory, the unease, the will to forget as if nothing had ever happened. But there is some of this in Germany as well, and I would like you to go into the sort of what you think are the deeper reasons why the shadow of this pact, you know, still sort of is somewhere over Germany, because it's the 23rd of August is not imprinted in the collective German memory of the Second World War, nor is the 17th of September something that people today in this country are very aware of. What do you think are the deeper tissues of remembrance here in this country?
Maybe that's a question for the non-Germans too. For the non-Germans to answer, I don't know. Okay, so I should be on the couch. Well, I think, you know, I mean, there are different layers, right? I mean, one of the fundamental things that needs to be talked about is, of course, our general ignorance of things East European. And then that we, after the war, especially in West Germany, you know, the whole concentration of remembering the war was the Germo-Franken friendship and, you know, reconciliation, the European community that then becomes the European Union, and all these things. that I think drew away the attention of a lot of our political elites, especially the Western political elites, from this East European lands and what happened there. I mean, part of it, I think, is the Iron Curtain, that it, for a long time, it seemed something that was far away in a distant place, somehow in a place that people couldn't go before 1989. And as I said, you know, there is sort of like already this memory of the Second World War by the time, you know, Eastern Europe gets liberated. And the other thing that we need to talk about then is, of course, the last 3 decades and our failure to change that, obviously, right? I mean, there was an initiative, I think about a decade ago, by then Federal President Gauck, together, I think, still with Václav Havel and other Central Europeans, to make 23rd of August a bigger day of commemoration of totalitarian regimes or something like that. But I don't think it fell onto much, or was not very successful with my colleagues and historians and also with our political elite in Germany, I think. We could speculate about the reasons. I mean, I think one of them I already mentioned is that there are already these like deeply ingrained days like 1st of September that will always play a big role, and 8th of May, of course, 8th and 9th of May. And yes, I think, you know, and I've said that for a long time, that part of, you know, reconciliation, of course, between Germany and Poland, or Germany and Eastern Europe, Germany and Ukraine, should be that we start learning more about their experiences in the 20th century, during the war, but also during communism, and that would help us all to better understand the world that we live in. And it is not something, I think, where we can be too proud of our record, especially post reunification.
That is why the initiative of Deutsch-Polnisches Haus is so important. It needs to be pursued, I hope, because just the matter of enlightenment that it brings into all kinds of problematic, not simply Polish-German issues, but it's also German-Russian story and relationships. It kind of provides a focus for opening up, I think, thinking and recollection and reflection on German history in European context.
I also had a question.
I'm sorry.
Ceded the microphone to my neighbor because she was first. First of all, I couldn't agree more to what you have just said. There's of course the need to pursue the effort to clarify what has been the facts of histories, even if we will never succeed to fully eliminate ambiguities that result of the very understandable different points of views of different parties. And I'm not talking only about countries, but also of populations and others affected. These ambiguities are also legitimate. On the other hand, we're living today, and some of you have underlined history doesn't repeat itself, but we have patterns that seem to repeat themselves just here, and we see efforts to counter a reduction of ambiguities, but to increase ambiguities. Particularly amongst those in our population who are not so deeply in the in the fact. What do you think is important from a present perspective, where we have elections in Germany, where we have elections in other parts of Europe, where we have non-valid elections in other parts of Eastern Europe, to put ourselves in a position of resilience and responsibility at the same time when we regard this history and the patterns that we are confronted with again. Thank you.
Maybe just a couple of words, and then maybe also from Ukraine. I mean, that would be nice. I think if we can learn one thing from remembering the Hitler-Stalin pact, it's actually that, you know, it raises the whole question, what sort of Europe we want to live in. Because what did it destroy? The Hitler-Stalin Pact basically destroyed the Wilsonian Europe of free and independent nation states that was created after the First World War. And we went back to an era of, the era of Yalta, of spheres of influence that lasted until 1999. And if I understand the war correctly, the Russian aggression against Ukraine that we see today, then at the very basic, this war is about whether we want to live in a Europe of spheres of influence again, where the Kremlin says Eastern Europe is basically our sphere of influence. We have a say whether these countries want to join NATO or the EU. You know, this is back to Yalta. If you look at Putin's demands of November 2021, if you read them carefully, he basically wants to go back to the era of Yalta. Or do we want to live in a Europe of free and sovereign nation states, a sort of like Wilsonian Europe that was created in 1920? I think this is at the core of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, or this is also at the core of European geopolitics today.
Liana, would you like to add a word?
Couldn't agree more.
What about Ukraine?
Yeah, I agree so much with you, and I think what we are facing right now and what we could learn on the example what's happening in Ukraine, it's all about learning history. And you know, like in case of Ukraine, I mean, we just started investigating the archives and having actually access to the archives, and like after the fall of Soviet Union. So you know, so like this history lessons, they are crucial for you know, for understanding and for articulating the voice. Yeah, and I mean, I don't really like this concept that history repeats every time, but I mean, like, if we are not learning history and if we are not learning how events they are interconnecting and how they are influencing each other, that we are just not able to build the future. Thank you.
I think we will slowly wrap up. I would just like to leave the floor for last question. Sorry, maybe last question, if...
I would like to make a point on the different narratives in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. When I've talked with people in Poland or in Estonia, nobody talks about the Cold War. They talk about the Russian oppression and the end of the Russian oppression in 1989, 1990. When you talk in West Europe, or especially Western Germany, this is the time of the Cold War, and I think this term hides the severe suppression of all of Eastern Europe. And to my point, I think this, what is termed Cold War, started with the Hitler-Stalin-Pact, with Russian attempts to move west with the help of Hitler. And I read I read about an interview that Stalin was to have made with, I think it was Dimitrov on September 6th in Moscow, when this Dimitrov had asked Stalin, why did we do this? And he said, well, let's fight those capitalist countries first, and then we'll see what happens. Or what do you know about this? But the Cold War is, my understanding, a very important point in not hiding the oppression in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Well, I take that more as a comment also than maybe as a question. I mean, of course, we can talk about all these terms like Cold War and what they explain and what they hide. I mean, what's interesting is, of course, what you pointed out about the Soviet occupation. I think that was a concept that somehow was invented, maybe, or was first used in the Baltic states, who always, said that we were never part of the Soviet Union. We were just occupied by the Soviet Union. But today you also have these museums of Soviet occupation in Georgia, for example, or Ukraine, or places like that. So it's proved to be a quite successful concept in explaining the Soviet period. But it also has its dangers, right? I mean, if you look at, for example, Lithuania in the 1980s or late 70s, most of the Communist Party, quite frankly, are Lithuanians, right? I mean, how much are they really under Soviet occupation? Or even if you look at Ukraine, there's a part of history where Ukrainians, Russian Ukrainians, people that also have very strong ties to Ukraine, like Khrushchev and Brezhnev, are ruling in the Kremlin. This is part of the imperial history of Russia that, I mean, Stalin was Georgian. What do we make out of all of this, right? So did the Georgians, like Orjonikidze and Stalin, occupy Russia at this point? So, how far can you take this occupation argument is my point, or how can you take the Cold War argument? We always have to see what are the problems with these words and concepts. But that isn't to say that it's not right. And I mean, especially for Polish history, I think of my Polish colleagues claim that there basically was no sovereign Poland between 1939 and 1989. And I think that's a fair argument to make. But that doesn't mean that there was no Polish politics at all in this period, right? I mean, there was plenty of Polish politics still under Russian, Nazi, Soviet domination. So we, what I don't like, I guess, about this occupation argument is sort of like it portrays people only as victims, and it takes away their agency, as if there was no agency under occupation, but there was agency for resistance, but also for collaboration. And these are again, complicated stories, like the complicated story of the Hitler-Stalin-Pact, that we need to investigate and that we need to tell, because then we understand all the complexities of East European history, I would say.
Now we are ending discussion with a lot of open questions, which are more about historical concepts than the facts. Thank you very much. We have a wine reception, as I was informed by the organizers. I would like to ask you to leave your devices on the chairs so that they can be collected from there. Thank you very much for your comments, for your lecture. Thank you very much for the questions.